Welcome to another book review. I'm ahead of the curve, and today I am reviewing The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. This book was published in 1973 and is predicated on psychotherapy and death anxiety. So in the introduction, there is a really good quote actually that I think sets the tone. "The terror of death is so overwhelming we conspire to keep it unconscious." This means that our knowledge of death subdues our ability to be content with our life. Hence we use materialism and religion to suppress this death anxiety. So chapter 2 is called The Terror of Death. So in this, Becker is suggesting the fear of death is behind all functioning, and if it was the conscious realm of being, we would not be able to live our lives with this objective sense of mortality being so clear to us. So he's basically saying that death is behind everything that we do, and I definitely believe that. Every kind of effort we make in life is in spite of our death, and so we need things like religion and films and art to make us feel like we're alive and feel like we're immortal when we're actually not. And so we, in a way, repress our death anxiety from all of these things, such as materialism, which is probably the most popular path of repression. So chapter 3 is psychoanalytic ideas. In this, Becker says, man creates himself to be a small god through a symbolic idea of existential being. He's kind of referencing us being the child that we once were. He's kind of suggesting the old trope of how the mother is the most dangerous thing to a child, but she's also the most important thing to a child, because the child's life is determined by the mother's upbringing of this child. But then again, something good that the mother may do for the child may actually turn out to be something bad for the child later on. And so really it's a double-edged sword. The maternal responsibility is a double-edged sword, really. So Becker goes on to say about how the knowledge of death for animals is basically subdued because they are not given the gift of consciousness as such, the ability to reflect on the past and to aspire to the future. And whilst we could argue that animals are less than us and how they are unfortunate, in one way they're not unfortunate, and in one way they're more than us, because really it is torturous to be conscious in many ways. Because for animals there's only a few minutes of fear, a few minutes of anguish, and then it's over. But to live a whole lifetime with the fate of death haunting one's dreams and even the most sun-filled days, that's something else. So really the human is actually the one who's tortured more than the animal, because the human is just cursed with this conscious degree of being compared to the animal. And the human also has responsibility, and they have to kind of plough through the abyss to get anywhere near some kind of justification for living in the first place. And interestingly, people are bothered with life when it is, without shrouds or without an archetype. And by this I mean, who likes to see life as it is? Let's be honest. Seeing life as it is as boring as watching paint dry. You could argue, well, nature is beautiful and there are many great things as they are. But then you have to remember, what we see and how we think of it depends on how we choose to see it. And so really, the nature around us is really only what we think it is, not what it actually is. And so we can't bear with the fact that nature is what it is. We have to put a connotation of what we believe we want it to be, because then we are reinvigorated with motivation to live and more meaning to live, and so we just shroud our eyes over. We pull the wool over our eyes. We don't like to see reality as it is. So chapter 4 is Human Character as a Vital Lie. In this, it is said by Becker that the animal is spared from complexity, such as is mentioned earlier, and the human is experimentally tortured by the nature of their complexity. And I follow on by this with this quote: "We don't want to admit that we are fundamentally dishonest about reality, that we do not really control our lives, and we don't want to admit that we do not stand alone, that we always have to rely on something that transcends us, some system of ideas and powers in which we are embedded and which support us." So this kind of comes down to the whole nature of reality kind of thing. And really, when we think about the nature of reality, we have to think about it in an analytical way. So this kind of reminds me of what Alan Watts said about reality. He said reality is like a Rorschach test. It is something abstract, something obscure. It is something that can't really be caught as it is, but it can only be caught in its past form. Take this, another example from Alan Watts, what he said. And I believe it was The Wisdom of Insecurity, the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. He said in this book that trying to capture water in a stream, trying to capture the stream as we see it is impossible. We can only capture the water as it is. Let's say if we have a bucket and we wish to capture the stream in a bucket, it is impossible to capture the stream in the bucket, because once we capture the stream, it no longer becomes a stream. It slips out of our hands. It becomes something else entirely. And so, really, when we try and grasp reality, we can't actually, it's a dead end. We can't grasp reality, because reality is only as it comes. There is no way to really analyze or understand reality as it comes. Only by really observing what is when it is. So in chapter 5, which is the psychoanalytic Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard is mentioned insofar as his theory on the immediate man, and I quote, does not recognize his true self. He only recognizes himself by his dress. He recognizes that he has only a self by externals. So this quote by Kierkegaard is backing up what's already been said. Becker's interpretation is this: man is confined by culture, and that he is thereby a slave to it, because he imagines that he has an identity if he pays his insurance, for example. We are thereby slaves to our social system. And we are slaves to our social system. I mean, if you think about it, let's say a religious person, the only reason most of the time that somebody is actually a Christian or a Hindu or a Muslim is because they've actually been brought up in a culture that teaches them to be so. It's not like they've actually read every scripture and said, I'll follow that one. No. Depending on our culture, depending on when we were born, this does determine what religion we join. If we were born in the Greek era of Socrates, then we would believe in Zeus or Thor. If we were born 500 years ago, we may be a Christian and we'd be killing a witch tomorrow evening. If we were born today, we'd most likely be a rational atheist. And you see my point. Our experiences are very, very dependent on our culture, and thus our whole experience, our whole being is a relative construction. Everything around us is a construction built by other people. It is, as Alan Watts said, a Rorschach test in itself. So Kierkegaard is referenced again, insofar as him saying that man never finds his true self. He never finds his true identity. And even if man can go into marriage, or he can buy a nice shiny car, or he can find meaning in his work, fundamentally, we never really understand ourselves, let alone other people. We are just enigmas. We are puzzles never to be solved. That is the nature of our existence. So I have to admit, chapter 6 is probably the most boring chapter out of them all, insofar as Freud basically being talked about profusely by Becker, his outdated theories are being referenced, his psychosexual work, that kind of stuff. Not a fan. I do believe wholeheartedly that Becker would probably marry Freud if he had the chance. So following on to chapter 7, which is called The Spell Cursed by Persons, the Nexus of Unfreedom. I have no idea what that is supposed to mean. Let's move on. So in this chapter, group psychology is discussed quite extensively, actually. Becker resorts to Freud's work insofar as him believing that groups don't necessarily bring new things out in people, but they do, however, surface the collective unconscious mentality that is shared amongst those in said groups. When we think of group psychology, as an example, I personally think of Charles Manson's group of his family, and I think of Nazi Germany. Becker does actually discuss Manson, and he also does discuss Hitler. He basically drives congruence between the two, insofar as both leaders as such finding values in their followers and getting their followers to find values in the leader's mentality, and thus the leader and follower become interchangeably connected in their selves. Charles Manson would get his followers to mirror his facial expressions spontaneously. So he would go up to a group member, he'd, pull some funny faces as he would. What this did, and this is genius, Manson got his followers to subconsciously conform to his actions. And as we all know from the Manson case, Manson did more than get his followers to conform. He got his followers to murder at his will. And so it is important to note that these followers of cults, they don't necessarily lose their self, but they are reimagined. Their selves are reimagined, not recreated, but reimagined. They have their intrinsic self underneath everything else, but they are just reimagined. And their mentality is just, as I said, in congruence with the leaders. So if the leader loses, then the follower does as well. So anything good or bad that happens to both, it affects both participants. And so this is again a group mentality that is embodied in these kind of examples in Nazi Germany and in the Manson family. So Becker mentions religion once again in saying that merging oneself with something larger is what keeps us sane, because we are no longer burdened by our existential isolation as it becomes shared with others, and others equal the denial of our own self, but the openness to others. This means that it is no longer of oneself, but of others, and so the individual's death anxiety is subdued. This quote is basically examining how in a group we kind of negate our individual responsibility, and so the responsibility, which people tend to avoid, the responsibilities of one is now made into a whole. And so not only does the individual gather an identity in this group, but they also are reassured of their own life having meaning. And so their death anxiety is subdued because their meaning is fulfilled. Or at least I would say in this case, their fake sense of meaning is subdued. So on to chapter 8, Otto Rank and the closure of psychoanalysis on Kierkegaard. Becker starts this chapter by suggesting that culture opposes nature and transcends it. Culture is the heroic negation of creatureliness, i.e. existentialism. Now, he's saying that culture opposes nature and transcends it. Culture shrouds what we think we know about everything. Culture negates death anxiety. Culture negates reality in many ways. Much of our experience is predicated on our culture. We have to depend on culture in terms of how we define our reality. Culture is our reality. So moving on to chapter 9, the present outcome of psychoanalysis. And this quote is interesting because this quote is probably my favourite out of the book, and this is from Otto Rank. He says, "With the truth, one cannot live." I think this is particularly profound because when the truth is not shrouded by archetypes or by a wool over our eyes, everything just becomes boring. Everything becomes as it is. And quite frankly, we hate things as they are. We need to shroud them. And as well as this, Becker also goes on to say that religion is something that is built into our psyche/culture. And whilst religion, I do believe, in terms of archetypes, they do resemble how we function on a daily basis and how the patterns of our thought are accumulated. However, I don't think this is a good enough basis to try and somehow validate religion's presence in society. This doesn't mean we should be religious, by all means. Again, religious doctrine does provide some kind of meaning out of the meaninglessness that a lot of people encounter in their lives, but by no means is it a healthy type of approach to living. Nor is it, I believe, necessary, because science does provide a lot of moral answers. And whilst that may be doubted by a lot of people, and in fact it is, It's like Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, in which he talks about how we don't need religion to derive our morals from. And so in this book, Harris basically discusses the fact that we can really look on a biological level and see that morals are actually ingrained into the structure of our being. And what I mean by this is, for example, tit for tat. You deflee me and I'll deflee you. It's the evolutionary aspect of this argument. So moving on to chapter 10, which is a general view of mental illness. This chapter is probably one of the most boring chapters because it's not that I find mental illness to be boring. I mean, it is very much the contrary. But it is most simply that the theories being introduced and talked about, which are in relation to Freud's work, again, the ideas are outdated. And there's not really much I can derive from this chapter, simply because the information is just misled. And Becker's trying to kind of beat a dead horse. He's trying to find validity where it can't be found, because quite frankly the theories they're not true, or at least they're not reliable. So chapter 11 is Psychology and Religion. What is the heroic individual? So Becker references Freud once again, insofar as Freud writing that we perhaps shouldn't cure a patient because not all patients wish to be cured. I actually really liked this idea. Not that it is exclusive to Becker. I think it is exclusive to Freud as such, because I know that Thomas Szasz wrote a fantastic book, The Myth of Mental Illness, in which he basically discusses how psychotherapy is very much a political gain for the government and not necessarily one for the people or the patients. He also goes on to say in the Myth of Mental Illness, much like Freud is saying, that in psychotherapy, a lot of the time it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, i.e. the patient being told something or being labelled as something, and basically they go on to believe that what they have been labelled, but the traits are actually manufactured within themselves. And so what I mean by this is that the more we label and draw conclusions on what people are in terms of the labels that we give them, the more we encourage them to act out in a way that is predetermined by what they believe they should be acting out as. Because psychotherapy is obviously used today effectively. I mean, psychotherapy, it is a reliable method to helping people, and I think as long as people find meaning and helpfulness in a treatment, and as long as it's not coercive as such, then by all means I think people should get the help that they need. So something that really kind of got my guard up, I suppose, in the book, Becker basically said that he thinks psychology is a belief system. I wholeheartedly disagree. It's the same claim that theists make on atheists, saying science is a belief system, atheism is a belief system. It's not. When we want to define a belief system, we have to remember certain things about what makes something a belief system. So let me really explain why psychology and atheism and science is not a belief system. Psychology is not a belief system because it does not prescribe a worldview, nor does it dictate humanity's role and purpose, nor does it prescribe rules and regulations, nor does it have sacred texts, objects, or locations, and it does not require faith. So all in all, I think if you're interested in psychotherapy, science, religion, Jung's work in archetypes, if you're interested in sociology, philosophy, existentialism, The Denial of Death is a very interesting book to read, by all means. So I think I'm going to wrap the video up there. If you wish to follow me on Goodreads, where you can see the books that I have read, that I want to read, that I am reading, and you can also message me when you look at that, and you can also say if you want me to discuss/review a particular book that I've read, that you've read, and that you want me to discuss. I'll be up for that. So the link to my Goodreads is in the bio, and the link to my Instagram is in the bio. I'm sure most of you already know me from Instagram, but if you don't, be sure to check that out. My main content is on there, so make sure to check that out. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.